Carl Gustav Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't found in psychiatry textbooks or descriptions of common mental illnesses. It was hidden in something far more disturbing. People who can see absolutely everything the world desperately tries to conceal. Jung didn't fear madness, for he understood it like few others, but he harbored a profound respect and reverent caution for those who bore the burden of total vision. In his clinical practice, he began to notice a silent and devastating pattern. It wasn't individuals losing their minds, but souls that were, tragically, too lucid. Jung realized that this extreme lucidity didn't liberate, it destroyed. Imagine possessing the involuntary ability to read every micro-expression, to smell hidden emotions, and to perceive psychological patterns that escape everyone else. For these people, the world is never just what it seems. They see through the social masks we wear to survive, detect lies the instant they are conceived, and feel the unconscious tensions vibrating in the air of any room they enter. Jung called this discovery dangerous because he observed that these people invariably ended up isolated, exhausted, and unable to maintain normal human relationships. The danger lay not in mental instability, but in the unbearable psychological cost of seeing the naked truth all the time. The case that opened Jung's eyes to this reality began in 1913, a crucial year in his own life, marked by his break with Freud and the beginning of his descent into his own unconscious. A patient arrived at his office carrying the weight of this terrible gift. She was an intuitive introvert, a rare type that Jung would describe in his private notes with a mixture of fascination and concern. This woman possessed what he called undifferentiated intuitive perception. She could walk into any room and, without anyone saying a word, know exactly who was lying, who was suffering in silence, and who harbored secret and dangerous resentments. Jung wrote that the patient displayed an extraordinary ability to perceive unconscious content in others, but he quickly noticed that this faculty caused her profound anguish rather than any social advantage. Her life was a minefield. She couldn't participate in banal conversations about the weather or everyday news because she saw through the facade of every person in front of her. How can someone talk about trivialities when they see the emotional storm, the betrayal, or the despair in the eyes of the other person? She couldn't maintain friendships because people felt inexplicably exposed and uncomfortable in her presence, as if they were naked before a silent judge. She couldn't hold down jobs because her mere presence seemed to disrupt the silent, unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning. Observing this woman, Jung realized he wasn't treating a pathology. He was witnessing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious, when perception becomes so differentiated as to threaten social survival. He documented how she described people with frightening accuracy. She spoke of others as if she had direct access to their most intimate diaries and their most forbidden thoughts. When Jung verified these observations through careful questioning of others, they proved remarkably accurate. It wasn't psychosis, it wasn't delusion, it was a consciousness so advanced that it had become socially dangerous. But why did this ability destroy those who possessed it? Jung began to understand that human society is built upon a necessary foundation of shared illusions. To coexist peacefully, we tacitly agree to ignore certain truths, to hide certain shadows, and to pretend that certain feelings do not exist. The individual who sees everything violates this fundamental contract simply by existing. He is the unwanted witness to the reality that everyone tries to deny. Jung discovered something even more disturbing as he deepened his analysis. This patient's extraordinary perception seemed impossible to explain by normal physical senses alone. This led Jung to investigate the phenomenon of participation mystique, or mystical participation, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve. He noted that these individuals, with their highly attuned intuition, did not merely observe from afar. They were overwhelmed. They absorbed the unconscious atmosphere of their environment, like a sponge absorbs dirty water. In his notes from the Red Book, Jung reflected that there are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not only spoken words, but the entire unconscious atmosphere around them. They carry the weight of secrets that are not their own, and pains that do not belong to them. Jung realized that the real danger was not just social isolation, but a threat to the very integrity of the soul. When you see everything, you become a mirror. And when you become such a clear and perfect mirror, the World around you can react in ways you would never expect. What happens when people are forced to look at what they fear most within themselves, reflected in the eyes of the all-seeing? The answer to this question revealed to Jung the cruel mechanism that transforms the gift of sight into a lonely curse. Jung discovered that the true torment of these individuals stemmed not only from what they saw, but from how the world reacted to their vision. He realized that this extraordinary perception seemed impossible to explain solely through the ordinary senses, leading him to investigate what he would call mystical participation. This phenomenon describes a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual is flooded by the unconscious of others. Modern research validates Jung's initial observations, showing that a significant portion of the population possesses heightened sensitivity. However, Jung identified something far more specific and rare within his typology: the introverted intuitive type. These people, who comprise perhaps only 1% of the population, not only feel deeply, they perceive unconscious patterns with a frightening clarity. The brains of these people process not only obvious social cues, but also repressed emotional states and secrets that others desperately try to hide. They see deep depression behind a forced smile at a party. They feel despair vibrating beneath a co-worker's confident presentation. They perceive the collective shadow that entire groups unconsciously agree to ignore to maintain apparent peace. Jung wrote that the danger lies not in perception itself, but in the brutal psychic isolation it creates. When someone clearly sees what others cannot or will not see, that person transforms into something society cannot tolerate: a living mirror. This creates what Jung called the problem of the higher function. His greatest strength becomes his greatest burden, because it separates him from the collective, unconscious participation that unites most people. But Jung discovered that the real danger was even more aggressive. Because these people see the unconscious contents of others so clearly, they become immediate targets for shadow projection. Jung extensively documented this defense mechanism. When someone's shadow, their flaws, fears, and hidden desires, is reflected by another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has only two choices: integrate the shadow, which is painful and difficult, or attack the mirror. In the vast majority of cases, the unconscious chooses the attack. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. The individual who sees the truth is blamed for creating the problems they are merely observing. His patients with heightened intuition experienced this constantly in their daily lives. When they gently suggested that someone seemed troubled, that person would explode in anger, accusing them of being negative or making things up. When they expressed concern about obvious problems in a family or business, they were accused of being judgmental or of fabricating crises where harmony supposedly reigned. Jung realized that this was neither coincidence nor paranoia on the part of his patients. It was an active psychological defense. In his memoirs, he wrote that everything that irritates us in others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But for most people, it is infinitely easier to attack the person who reflects their shadow than to examine what is being reflected. This creates the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in any group they enter, not because they cause conflict, but because their mere presence reveals conflicts that already exist and that the group prefers to keep buried. The bearer of this superior perception becomes the repository of everything the group cannot consciously admit about itself. This pattern explains why these people don't just feel misunderstood, they feel systematically targeted by a force they cannot rationally explain. They wonder why their attempts to help are met with hostility, or why their honesty is treated as an offense. Jung understood that they were fighting against an invisible and powerful force, the human need to keep their illusions intact. However, Jung's most unsettling discovery was yet to come. He observed that this overwhelming perception was not uniform. It manifested itself in radically different ways in each individual, as if the unconscious chose specific channels to overflow. He identified 4 distinct patterns within this rare type, each representing a different and often painful way of processing the secrets of the world. Understanding your own pattern is not just a matter of self-knowledge. According to Jung, it is a matter of psychic survival in a world that prefers to sleep rather than wake. Jung delved deeply into the psyche of his patients and realized that this invasion of the unconscious is not a uniform phenomenon, but rather a force that seeks specific ways to manifest itself in each individual. He identified 4 distinct patterns, 4 ways in which the human soul tries to process the unbearable weight of seeing everything, and recognizing which pattern is yours can be the key to stop drowning and start swimming. The first type Jung documented was the intuitive sentimental, a figure who lives in a state of perpetual emotional contagion. For these people, the boundary between self and other is practically non-existent on the level of feelings. They not only perceive someone's sadness or anger, they absorb it as if it were their own. Imagine entering a room where everyone is smiling, but feeling a sudden and overwhelming wave of anguish, without knowing that it emanates from a single person in the opposite corner who hides a deep grief. The intuitive, sentimental person carries the weight of the unlived emotions of everyone around them, often arriving at the end of the day exhausted, confused, and unable to distinguish which feelings truly belong to them and which are psychic intruders they've picked up along for the ride. The second pattern revealed by Jung is perhaps the most disturbing for those who live with it: the intuitive thinker. This type doesn't absorb emotions, but rather the invisible architecture of destiny. They see psychological patterns with a cold, logical clarity that is frightening. Jung observed that these individuals possess a mysterious ability to foresee relational disasters, professional failures, and personal collapses months or even years before they happen. This isn't magical divination, but an unconscious recognition of cause and effect that escapes most. They look at a newly in-love couple and see with absolute certainty the bitter divorce that will come in 3 years, based on micro-signals of behavior that no one else noticed. They see the logical conclusion of processes that are still in their seed. The burden of this type is that of unheard prophecy. They often try to warn others about the precipice ahead, only to be called pessimists or doomsayers, until the inevitable happens exactly as they predicted. The third type, the intuitive sensory type, lives in a reality where the body becomes a highly precise biological radar. Jung documented cases of patients who served as early warning systems for physical illnesses and disorders in their environment. These people feel in their own bodies the physical manifestation of the psychological state or illness of another. They may feel a sudden pain in their knee when sitting next to someone with inflammation, or an inexplicable nausea when talking to someone who harbors toxic lies. Often, these individuals wander from doctor to doctor, seeking cures for pains that do not originate in their own biology, but are somatic reflections of the unhealthy environment in which they live, or the people with whom they interact. For them, truth is not something one thinks or feels. It is something that hurts in the flesh. Finally, Jung identified the rarest and most vulnerable type of all, the pure intuitive. These souls combine introverted intuition with an as-yet undifferentiated auxiliary function, meaning they see absolutely everything but lack the psychological structure to organize or express what they perceive. They live in a state of constant overwhelm, a psychic flood where concrete reality and the symbolic world mix unfiltered. They receive vast amounts of information from the collective unconscious, images, sensations, patterns, secrets, but lack the tools to translate it into comprehensible human language. Jung noted that these individuals often seem disconnected or airy, not because they are empty, but because they are too full, overflowing with a wisdom they cannot channel. Jung understood that each of these 4 types faces a monumental challenge. Modern society, with its emphasis on superficiality and linear logic, offers no space for these deep processes. The sentimental intuitive is labeled dramatic or overly sensitive. The thinking intuitive is seen as cold and calculating. The sensory is treated as a hypochondriac, and the pure is often marginalized as inept. However, Jung knew that these were not character flaws, but rather different facets of the same dangerous jewel. The tragedy, according to him, is that most of these people spend their lives trying to shut off this perception, trying to anesthetize themselves to fit into a world that seems too small for their vision. But trying to close these inner eyes does not bring peace. It only brings neurosis and illness. The real danger that Jung identified was not in being one of these types, but in what happens when this superior perception remains without proper integration, transforming from a gift into a weapon pointed at one's own identity. Jung understood that total perception, when not integrated, acts like an acid that corrodes the structure of conventional reality. He observed that human society functions to a large extent, thanks to a vast and silent agreement of mutual blindness. Families, businesses, and nations depend on vital lies and strategic omissions to maintain cohesion. The individual who sees everything, therefore, is not merely an observant person. He is a flaw in the system, a living threat to collective stability. Jung called this a rupture of the collective unconscious. By entering a room and seeing the truth that everyone agreed to ignore, this individual nullifies the invisible social contract, becoming a destabilizing element even if he remains in absolute silence. The second danger Jung mapped out is existential isolation, or what he called the problem of the higher function. This is not merely physical loneliness, but living on a frequency of reality that no one else tunes into. Imagine being the only sober person at a party that lasts a lifetime, where everyone else is intoxicated by their own illusions. The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. Jung wrote that the individual becomes an island of lucidity in an ocean of unconsciousness, and this separation creates an insurmountable abyss. He observed that many of these seers begin to doubt their own sanity, because when their reality is never validated by others, the mind begins to fragment under the weight of doubt. How long can a person survive unscathed in a reality that only they perceive before they begin to believe that the error lies in their eyes and not in the world they observe? But the most lethal danger, the one Jung feared above all, was the dissolution of identity. He discovered that people who constantly absorb the unconscious contents of others risk losing touch with their own soul. Jung called this participation mystique in its pathological state, a fusion where the boundaries of the self dissolve. The individual becomes so inundated by the fears, desires, and pains of others that they no longer know where they end and where the collective begins. It is psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individuality in favor of collective possession. You become an open channel through which all the psychic garbage of the environment passes, unfiltered and defenseless. To combat this existential threat, Jung did not suggest medication or suppression of the gift, but rather a rigorous process of inner alchemy that he called individuation. He realized that the only way to survive the total vision was to build a psychic structure strong enough to withstand it. The first phase of this process is recognition and differentiation. Jung taught his patients to practice conscious discrimination, a constant mental exercise of separating what is self from what is non-self. He prescribed deliberate isolation, not as escape, but as mental hygiene, a necessary time for the emotional dust of others to settle and for the person to hear, once again, their own inner voice. Have you ever felt an overwhelming emotion, like sudden anger or deep sadness, and known deep down that this feeling didn't belong to you, but had taken hold of you? The second phase of individuation is perhaps the most difficult, the integration of the shadow. Jung discovered a fascinating paradox. Those who see the shadow of others so clearly often do so because they have not integrated their own. If you deny your capacity for cruelty, deceit, or selfishness, seeing these qualities in others will be unbearable and destabilizing. Jung wrote that everything that irritates us in others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but this requires brutal courage. To look evil in the eye without blinking, you need to recognize that the seed of that same evil lives in your own heart. Only then does perception cease to be a moral judgment and become a neutral and compassionate observation. The final stage is conscious participation. Jung envisioned the integrated individual not as someone who withdraws from the world, but as someone who can bear the weight of others' unconscious without being crushed by it. It is the development of what he called a psychological container. The goal is not to stop feeling, but to create an internal space where the emotions of others can be perceived, honored, and then released, without clinging to one's own identity. The individual becomes a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, capable of transforming the atmosphere of an environment simply by being present and centered. But human history is a graveyard of souls who attempted this crossing and failed. Jung knew that theory was not enough. It was necessary to look at living examples. What differentiates a genius who changes the era from a madman who gets lost in the labyrinth? The answer to this question led Jung to analyze historical figures, who possessed this same dangerous gift, revealing the thin line that separates absolute transcendence from total destruction. For Jung, history was not merely a sequence of dates, but a laboratory of human psychology, where the fate of those who see too much had already been written many times. He pored over the records of the past to understand what differentiated the visionary genius from the lost madman, and found in Friedrich Nietzsche the most tragic and brilliant example of the danger that surrounded his patients. Nietzsche not only saw through the social, religious, and moral facades of his time, he pulverized them with what he called philosophizing with a hammer. Jung observed that Nietzsche possessed such keen intuition that he anticipated the catastrophes of the 20th century and the death of the old gods. But he made a fatal mistake. He never built a protective wall between his conscious mind and the volcano of truths erupting within him. He identified with his superior role, believing himself to be the very embodiment of the truth he saw, isolating himself in an ivory tower of intellectual superiority until psychic tension broke through his mind, leading to his complete collapse in the streets of Turin. In stark contrast, Jung studied the life of the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart. Eckhart also saw the hidden realities of the soul and the abysses of divinity that the dogmatic church tried to conceal. But, unlike Nietzsche, he did not use his vision as a weapon to wound the world, but as a torch to illuminate it. Jung noted that Eckhart maintained what he called conscious humility. He saw the truth, but understood that he was only a channel for it, not its source. Where Nietzsche found isolation and madness, Eckhart found connection and service, transforming dangerous perception into wisdom that nourished others without destroying the bearer. He proved that it is possible to look at the sun without going blind, as long as you keep your feet firmly planted on the ground of ordinary humanity. But it was in his own flesh that Jung validated his most important discovery. During the dark years between 1913 and 1919, a period that resulted in his mysterious Red Book, Jung experienced his own descent into hell. He was assailed by apocalyptic visions of blood covering Europe even before the First World War began, and heard voices and saw images that would lead any psychiatrist to diagnose severe psychosis. Jung wrote that he was threatened with total fragmentation and was only saved by a crucial understanding. This was not illness, it was evolution. He realized that his overwhelming perceptions were not a biological defect, but consciousness painfully attempting to evolve beyond current collective limitations. He was not mad, he was seeing the future that the collective unconscious was gestating. This revelation transformed how he dealt with the isolation of his patients. Jung understood that no one, however strong, can bear the weight of total vision alone. The myth of the wise hermit is dangerous. To survive, psychologically, the individual needs to find what Jung called the few who understand. He identified that the cure for toxic isolation is not trying to be understood by everyone, but finding 3 specific types of allies. The first is the individuated kindred spirit, that rare person you instantly recognize in a glance or a phrase and feel an immediate resonance, as if speaking a secret dialect that no one else in the room understands. It is the encounter of 2 exiles who discover they are not alone. The second ally is the sincere seeker, one who, even without possessing total vision, is actively engaged in their own individuation process and therefore does not fear the truth. Jung said that those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others. And the third is the natural vessel, people of emotional maturity and stability who, although they do not see the invisible, possess an internal structure solid enough to hear accounts from the abyss without feeling vertigo or the need for defense. To navigate these relationships, Jung developed a protocol of gradual disclosure. He taught that one should never unload the totality of one's perception onto someone unprepared, as this is an act of psychic violence that generates rejection. The secret is to test the waters. Begin with a small, gentle observation and observe the reaction. Is the person curious or defensive? Do they ask questions or shut down? If there is defensiveness, retreat. That door is closed. If there is openness, move forward. Jung emphasized that the goal is not to find an audience, but to find resonance. The search for these allies is not a social luxury, but a biological necessity for the visionary. Without this safe mirroring, the mind begins to doubt its own reality. But Jung knew that even with allies, the path to integration is full of seductive traps. The human ego is cunning and loves to hijack spiritual gifts for its own ends. Jung saw many begin the journey well only to fall into subtle detours that transformed the blessing of vision into a new form of imprisonment, proving that the ultimate enemy is not outside, in the blind world, but within, in the very vanity of the one who sees. Jung knew that the path to integration is a minefield, where the most dangerous enemy is not the blind world outside, but the very vanity of the one who sees. He observed that as soon as an individual realizes they possess this privileged vision, the human ego, always hungry for power and distinction, attempts to hijack this gift for its own selfish ends. The first and most seductive trap Jung identified is psychic inflation. Imagine discovering that you see what no one else sees. The temptation to believe oneself a prophet, a savior, or a spiritually superior being is almost irresistible. Jung warned that, in this state, the person does not possess the archetype of wisdom, they are possessed by it. They cease to dialogue with humanity and begin to preach to it, transforming intuition into arrogance and clarity into implacable judgment. The Messiah complex isolates the individual in an ivory tower, where he believes his mission is to save those he considers inferior or asleep, forgetting that true wisdom operates at eye level, never from top to bottom. But if inflation is the burning fire, the second trap is the paralyzing ice, justified withdrawal. Jung saw many promising souls use their keen perception as a perfect excuse to give up on life in society. They look at the unconsciousness of the masses, at the political and social lies, and decide that the world is not worthy of their presence. They convince themselves that isolation is a sign of spiritual nobility, when in reality it is merely fear disguised as superiority. Jung was categorical in stating that the hermit who flees from life has not transcended it, but has been defeated by it. True individuation requires you to descend the mountain and walk in the marketplace, keeping your light burning amidst the chaos, not hidden in a safe cave where no one can challenge you. The third trap is perhaps the most insidious, as it disguises itself as virtue, the addiction to helping. The highly perceptive individual feels the pain of another even before the other feels it, and the immediate impulse is to heal, fix, intervene. Jung called this a subtle form of power, where the person's identity merges completely with their usefulness. You become addicted to being needed, sacrificing your own health and development to carry burdens that are not yours. This is not love. It is a lack of boundaries that inevitably leads to burnout and resentment. Jung saw that many wounded healers end up destroyed because they try to save the world to avoid the much more difficult task of saving themselves. However, for those who manage to navigate these treacherous detours without being caught, Jung revealed an evolutionary truth that changes everything. He believed that nature does not waste energy, and that nothing in the human psyche is a biological accident. If you were born with this dangerous perception, it's not a manufacturing defect. You are a prototype. Jung introduced the concept of culture bearers, individuals whose psychological structure is, literally, ahead of their time. He proposed that the evolution of human consciousness does not happen en masse, but begins in isolated individuals who function as advanced scouts in uncharted territory. Have you ever stopped to think that the anxiety, tension, and discomfort you feel might not be your personal problems, but rather symptoms of a collective illness that your body is registering before everyone else? Jung suggested that these individuals function as an early warning system for the species. They sense moral contradictions, environmental dangers, and social failings long before they become visible catastrophes. What society calls excessive sensitivity is, in Jung's view, a vital capacity for future adaptation. The pain you feel when perceiving falsehood is not a weakness. It is a given, crucial information that the collective needs to correct its course. The individual who sees everything is the laboratory where nature is testing new forms of consciousness. The unbearable tension you carry is the necessary friction to ignite a new light in human darkness. This perspective transforms suffering into purpose. You are not isolated because you are strange. You are isolated because you are at the forefront. The scout always walks alone ahead of the tribe, exposed to dangers to ensure the group's survival. The question Jung leaves hanging in the air, creating an almost palpable tension for the outcome of this journey, is not whether you will be able to rid yourself of this perception, but whether you will have the titanic courage to accept that your life does not belong only to you. The great turning point is realizing that your curse is, in fact, the only hope for evolution in a world that sleepwalks towards the abyss. And now, knowing what you are and the real danger you face, only the final step remains: the definitive transformation that converts poison into medicine. Remember that patient who arrived at Jung's office in 1913, on the verge of collapse because she saw the stark truth of everyone around her? Her story didn't end in tragedy. After 3 years of profound individuation work, she didn't stop seeing. She didn't become normal, nor did she lose her sharp perception. What changed was her relationship with the gift. She learned to distinguish what was hers and what belonged to others. She built the necessary psychic walls so that her house wouldn't be flooded by every external storm. Jung reported with visible satisfaction that she became an extraordinary counselor, using her vision no longer as an open wound, but as a precise scalpel to aid in the healing of others. She found her place not by suppressing her nature, but by elevating it. This is Carl Jung's final and definitive message to you. Your superior perception is not a factory defect. It is an evolutionary resource that arrived too early. You are not broken because you sense what others ignore. You are psychologically ahead. The suffering you carry is not a sign of illness. It is the price of pioneering. Jung believed that humanity advances through individuals who have the courage to carry consciousness, where before there was only darkness. You are a bearer of culture, a scout who goes ahead in the evolution of the species, sensing dangers and truths before the collective is ready to awaken. The world desperately needs your insights, but it needs them delivered with strategy, wisdom, and love, not with desperation or judgment. Your life's task is not to become blind to fit into a world of sleepwalkers, but to develop the inner strength to carry your own light without trembling. Healing is not about ceasing to see. It's about learning to see with compassion and detachment. It's understanding that you are the observer, not the sponge. Jung taught us that the ultimate goal of individuation is to transform poison into medicine. That which once isolated you, your ability to see the shadow, the lie, and the pain, now becomes your greatest contribution. When you integrate your shadow and assume your place, you cease to be a victim of others' unconsciousness and become an anchor of consciousness. You validate reality. You name the unnameable. You become living proof that it is possible to be in this world without being consumed by it. Therefore, do not wish to be less than you are. The anguish you have felt until now was merely the necessary friction to polish the mirror of your soul. The danger of seeing everything is not seeing too much. It is that you may never learn to use what you see with the wisdom that your gift demands. If you recognized yourself in the description of this rare and dangerous type, know that your solitude ends here. You are part of a silent lineage of guardians of consciousness that has always existed to prevent humanity from becoming completely lost in its own illusions. The final question Jung leaves you with is not, how do I stop feeling? But rather, are you ready to accept responsibility for what you see? The world doesn't need you to save it. The world needs you to be whole. For as Jung wrote, the only thing that truly changes the world is the presence of an individual who has truly become themselves. If these words resonated deep within you, if you felt that someone finally described the reality you live in secret, don't let this moment be lost in digital oblivion. Leave a comment below, even anonymously, sharing which of the 4 types of perception you identified in yourself. Your experience is proof that Jung was right. Subscribe to the channel to continue this journey into the depths of the human psyche and discover the other truths that conventional psychology preferred to forget. You are no longer alone in wakefulness. Welcome to consciousness.